My name's Ethan Myers, and I'm a third-year history major at Greystone University. Now, this place is old, like, really old. You can almost feel the weight of its history pressing down on you when you walk through the halls, especially in the West Wing. That part of the university has been closed off for as long as I can remember. Students used to whisper about it between classes, but it wasn't until my sophomore year that the rumors really started getting to me. They say that years ago some kid tried to get into a locked room there and no one ever saw him again. You know how it is with stories like these, right? They start small, just a little tale to freak out the freshmen. But the more you hear it, the more you can't help but wonder if there's any truth to it. I wasn't the only one either. My friends, Greg, Sam, and Alex, we'd talk about it over beers, daring each other to see who could get closest to the West Wing before chickening out. We never really believed it. Not at first. I mean, how could we? But as the months went by, the obsession grew. It's hard to explain, but the more I thought about that locked door, the more it felt like it was calling to me. Like there was something behind it just waiting to be found. And I wasn't the only one who felt that pull. Greg was especially fixated on it. He'd always been the thrill seeker in our group, the guy who'd do anything for a little adrenaline rush. And this locked room? It became his latest challenge. The funny thing is, none of the staff ever mentioned the room. It was like it didn't even exist. When we asked around, all we got were shrugs and awkward glances. Even the campus security seemed to avoid the West Wing. That only fueled the mystery. It was like the university was trying to hide something, and we were determined to find out what. I still remember the way Greg's eyes would light up every time someone mentioned that room. He was so sure we'd find something amazing, something worth the risk. Looking back, I realize how stupid we were. But at the time, it felt like the most exciting thing we'd ever do. We planned it all out. One late night, just the four of us. We'd sneak in, find the door, and see what was really going on. It was just supposed to be a harmless adventure, something we could laugh about later. But now, thinking about it, I wonder how we didn't see the signs. How we didn't feel the weight of what was coming. Because from the moment we set foot in that West Wing, nothing felt right. The air was heavy and the silence was thick, almost like the building itself was holding its breath. That's when I knew. This wasn't just some stupid campus rumor, this was real. And we were about to step into something way bigger than we ever imagined. That night, the four of us, Greg, Sam, Alex, and I, met outside the West Wing just after midnight. The campus was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. We brought flashlights, of course, but even their beams seemed weaker in that part of the campus, swallowed up by the darkness surrounding us. Greg, as usual, took the lead. He was practically bouncing with excitement, his grin wide as he gestured for us to follow him inside. The door to the West Wing creaked open with this long, drawn-out groan that sent a shiver down my spine. It was like the building didn't want us there, like it was warning us to turn back. But we didn't. We were too caught up in the thrill of it all to care. Once inside, the air felt different, thicker, colder. It wasn't the usual damp chill of an old building either. It was like the place was waiting. We made our way down the hallway, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. I remember the way the shadows seemed to stretch and move, almost like they were alive. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. After all, we were about to break into the most mysterious part of the university. Who wouldn't be a little jumpy? Finally, we reached the door. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was no plaque, no sign, nothing to indicate what the room had been used for. Greg didn't hesitate. He pulled out a crowbar he'd brought and started prying at the lock. Sam and Alex kept watch while I stood by, my heart racing. I still remember the sound it made when the lock finally gave way, this sharp metallic snap that echoed down the hallway. Greg pushed the door open, and for a moment we just stood there, staring into the darkness beyond. The room looked empty. But there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the dust or the stale air, it was the feeling that we weren't alone. And then, almost on cue, we heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, coming from somewhere behind us. We all froze, our flashlights darting around the hallway, but there was no one there. I remember Greg laughing, trying to shake off the tension, but none of us were smiling. The footsteps continued for another few seconds before stopping altogether, leaving us in a silence that felt heavier than before. It was as if the building itself was watching us now, waiting to see what we'd do next. The moment we stepped into that room, the air changed. It was colder, sharper, like every breath I took was cutting into my lungs. The room itself looked untouched, like no one had been inside for years. Old furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, and the walls were peeling, but everything felt frozen, as if time had stopped the moment we opened that door. And yet, despite the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We started exploring, our flashlights bouncing off the walls and casting weird, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every step echoed in the silence, but underneath it all, there was this faint sound, like whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but it didn't sound natural. It was like someone, or something, was talking just out of earshot, its words lost in the air. I could see the tension growing in Sam and Alex, but Greg? He pushed on, more curious than ever. Then Greg suddenly stopped. His face went pale, and he stumbled, collapsing to his knees. At first, we thought he'd tripped, but when we got closer, we saw the look in his eyes, wide, terrified, like he'd seen something none of us could. His skin was cold, clammy, and when we tried to ask what was wrong, he just muttered under his breath, something about eyes in the dark. That's when the whispering grew louder, filling the room like a swarm of voices all speaking at once. We panicked. Sam grabbed Greg's arm, trying to pull him up, and Alex was already moving towards the door. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was like the door had locked itself, trapping us inside. I yanked on it harder and harder, but nothing. And all the while, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows on the walls, those twisted moving shapes, seemed to stretch toward us. That's when it hit me. Whatever this was, it was feeding on us. Our fear. The more terrified we got, the stronger it seemed to become. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, like something was closing in around us. I could feel it in my gut, this gnawing sense of dread, as if we'd crossed a line we were never meant to cross. Greg was still on the floor, shaking, his eyes fixed on the darkness in the corners of the room, as if he could see something we couldn't. We had to get out. Alex was banging on the door now, his fists slamming against the wood, but it was useless. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw it. A shape, darker than the shadows around it, standing in the far corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching us, watching me. And it wanted something. The next few days after that night felt like a blur. Greg, who had always been the strongest of us, was the first to show signs that something was seriously wrong. He barely spoke after we got back to the dorms, just mumbled about eyes in the dark whenever we tried to talk to him. At first, we thought maybe he was just shaken up from the whole experience. I mean, who wouldn't be? But it didn't take long to realize it was something more. Something deeper. He stopped going to classes, barely left his room, and when I went to check on him, it was like I didn't even recognize him anymore. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes looked haunted, like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him what he saw in that room, but all he'd say was, "It's still here. It never left." That's when I knew whatever had been in that room wasn't done with us. The weird thing is, it wasn't just Greg. All of us started noticing things. Small at first, but they piled up. I'd catch glimpses of figures in the corners of my vision, shadows that seemed too dark, too real, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Sam mentioned feeling cold spots in his dorm, even though the heat was on full blast. And Alex? Well, Alex swore he could hear whispers when he was alone, even though no one was around. By the time a week had passed, The campus felt different, colder, heavier. It wasn't just us feeling it either. Other students started talking about weird things happening around the West Wing. Lights flickering, strange noises at night, the feeling that someone was watching them when they walked by. It was like whatever we'd released was spreading, feeding off the fear it had planted in us. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected to what happened to Greg. Whatever had affected him wasn't just some kind of mental breakdown. It was like the thing from that room had latched onto him, feeding off his guilt and fear. And it wasn't letting go. Every time I saw him, he looked worse, more drained, as if the life was being sucked out of him bit by bit. And the worst part? I started to feel like we were next. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I had this horrible dream. No, it felt more like a memory of that room. Only this time, the shadows had faces, eyes. They were staring right at me, waiting for me to mess up, to show fear. And when I looked in the mirror the next morning, I swear, for just a second, I saw something standing behind me. Something dark, with glowing eyes, watching. It was only a matter of time before it came for us all. We thought maybe if we just ignored it, if we acted like nothing happened, it would go away. But deep down, we knew the truth. Whatever we had awakened in that room wasn't going to stop until it had consumed us all. And Greg? He was just the beginning. I couldn't take it anymore. Watching Greg slowly waste away, hearing Sam and Alex talk about the shadows and whispers, it was driving me insane. Something had to be done, and I was the only one willing to do it. I figured if we could close whatever we had opened, maybe, just maybe, we could stop it from spreading. I didn't tell the others. I knew they'd try to talk me out of it, or worse, they'd want to come with me. This was something I had to do alone. That night, I found myself standing in front of the West Wing again, flashlight in hand. The air was even colder than before, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, heavier with each step I took. The hallway felt longer this time. The walls seemed to close in around me. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside, sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had to get back to that room. I had to end this. When I finally reached the door, it felt different. The wood was ice cold under my fingers, and for a moment, I hesitated. But then, I thought about Greg, about what was happening to him, and how we'd all started to fall apart. I didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as we'd left it, dusty, dark, and filled with that suffocating cold air. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting for me. I walked further into the room, my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. The shadows danced around me, moving in ways that didn't make sense. And I just knew, that I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices all blending together. But they weren't just random sounds anymore. They were speaking to me, telling me things, horrible, twisted things about my deepest fears, my regrets, my mistakes. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the same dark figure from before, only now it was clearer. The shadows seemed to ripple and bend around it, forming a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Its eyes, those glowing, empty eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of terror crash over me. It wasn't just fear. It was like every regret, every guilt I'd ever felt was being ripped open and thrown back at me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into those eyes. Time didn't seem to exist in that room anymore. It was like the creature had trapped me in some kind of endless loop of fear and regret, feeding on my worst thoughts. And then it spoke, not in words, but in my mind. It whispered, "You opened the door. You let me in." That's when I realized. It was never about the room. It was about us, about the guilt and fear we carried with us. And now, it had us all. Before I could even react, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the room, followed by a deafening silence. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. The creature took a step toward me, and I knew there was no going back. This wasn't just about what we'd done that night. It was about everything we'd ever done. And now it was too late to stop it. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was that voice echoing in my head. You can't escape what you brought upon yourself. It's funny, really. You don't think much about your roommate until something about them starts to feel off. My name's Emily Ross, and I'm a third-year psychology student at Manton University. I never really expected to be telling this kind of story, but life's strange like that, right? Anyway, it all started pretty normally. I'd just been assigned a new roommate, Claire. She seemed nice enough, quiet, polite, didn't bother me with loud music or obnoxious parties. Perfect, right? But, as with most things, perfection doesn't last. It wasn't until the second or third week that I noticed something weird. You know how, when you live with someone, they have this presence? Like, you just know they're there, even when you're not in the same room? Well, Claire was the opposite. If she wasn't in my direct line of sight, it felt like she didn't exist. No one else in the dorm even mentioned her. At first, I figured she just kept to herself outside of our room. You know how some people are introverts to the extreme, but then things started feeling strange. You ever get that feeling like someone's standing right behind you, but when you turn around, no one's there? I started feeling that a lot. It was subtle at first, like a shadow out of the corner of my eye, or the faint sound of footsteps behind me. But every time I'd turn around, there was no one. Claire would just sit on her bed, staring at her phone, or reading a book, completely oblivious. I brushed it off as stress. Exams were coming up, and sleep was a luxury I wasn't getting enough of. One day I was sitting in the common area talking to a friend and mentioned Claire in passing. The look they gave me, it was like I'd said something insane. "Who?" they asked. I laughed it off, thinking they just hadn't met her yet, but that look stuck with me. I tried bringing her up with a few more people, but no one seemed to know who I was talking about. It's a big university, sure, but not that big. And that's when the nagging thought in the back of my mind started growing. I decided to pay closer attention. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire didn't exist outside of our room. Every time we walked through the halls together, no one said hi to her. No one acknowledged her. It was like she was invisible. I started watching more closely, trying to catch someone, anyone, making eye contact with her. But it was like she faded into the background, like a ghost. I tried telling myself I was overthinking it, but the more I watched, the more I felt unsettled. One night after a long day of classes, I came back to the room and found Claire just sitting there, staring at the wall. She didn't even blink when I walked in. I tried talking to her, but she barely responded, like she was in some kind of trance. And then it hit me. No one else acknowledged her because outside of our room she didn't exist. I don't know how I knew it, but I knew. Something wasn't right about Claire, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized. I didn't actually know her at all, and that's where things really started to spiral. The first time it happened, I was half asleep, so I almost convinced myself it didn't. I'd just gotten up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. You know how it is, groggy and barely awake, fumbling for the light switch. When I walked past the mirror, I saw Claire standing in front of it, her back to me, staring into her own reflection. Except when I glanced up, her reflection wasn't there. I stopped, blinking, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. But there was no mistaking it. She was standing right there, yet the mirror showed nothing. I felt my stomach twist, but I didn't say anything. I mean, what could I say? "Hey, why don't you have a reflection?" Yeah, that would have gone over well. So I just went back to bed, telling myself I was seeing things, that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew what I saw, and it left me feeling unsettled. It was the kind of weird that gets under your skin and stays there, no matter how much you try to ignore it. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Claire was her usual quiet self, and I almost managed to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or some bizarre hallucination. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was wide awake, and when I walked past the bathroom mirror, there she was. Same spot, same eerie stare into the glass, but still no reflection. It was like the mirror was rejecting her, like she wasn't real. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I found myself avoiding mirrors altogether. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what my gut was already screaming at me. I mean, how do you rationalize something like that? People are supposed to have reflections. It's just normal. But Claire wasn't, and the more I thought about it, the more I started to notice other things that were off about her. Little things that I hadn't really paid attention to before, like how she never used the bathroom when I was around, or how I never saw her eat. I know that sounds stupid, but when you live with someone, you notice those things. Except with Claire, there was nothing to notice. She existed in this weird, in-between space, always there, but never really present. And then there was the way she moved, so quietly, like she barely touched the ground. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me started to wonder if she was even human. I couldn't stop thinking about the mirrors, though. Every time I walked past one, I'd feel this cold knot of fear in my chest, like I was about to see something I shouldn't. And I knew, eventually, I wouldn't be able to avoid it. Something was wrong with Claire, and whatever it was, I was stuck with it in that tiny shared dorm room. The thought made my skin crawl, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I decided to stay quiet for a while longer, but I kept my eyes open, watching, waiting, trying to make sense of what was happening. But every night, when I'd catch a glimpse of Claire in that mirror without a reflection, it was like reality itself was bending. Like the rules didn't apply to her, and I was the only one who noticed. It wasn't just the mirrors anymore. As the days went by, the air in our room started to feel off. At first, it was just a slight chill. You know how dorm rooms are. Poor heating, old buildings, the usual. But then it got worse. Every night, as soon as the sun went down, the temperature would drop, like the room itself was freezing over. I'd be shivering under my blankets, but Claire never seemed to notice. She'd sit there, perfectly still, her face expressionless, as if the cold didn't bother her at all. One night it was so cold that I could see my breath hanging in the air. That's when I heard it. Whispers. Not loud, just faint enough to make me question if I was really hearing them at all. They weren't coming from Claire, though. No. These whispers seemed to seep out of the walls, like the very room was alive, breathing in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, the old pipes, anything rational. But the more I listened, the more I realized they were forming words, or at least they sounded like words, though I couldn't quite make them out. I brought it up casually with Claire the next day, asking if she'd noticed how cold the room was at night. She just shrugged, barely looking up from her book. "I don't feel cold," she said in that flat, monotone voice she always used. That was it. No explanation, no curiosity. It was like she didn't care, or worse, like she wasn't supposed to care. The whispers, the cold. It was all starting to get to me. But the scariest part wasn't the room itself. It was how no one else seemed to notice any of it. I tried talking to other students in the building, asking if they'd noticed anything strange. But every time I brought up Claire, they gave me the same blank look, like they had no idea who I was talking about. Even the RA, who's supposed to know everyone on the floor, didn't seem to remember her. Maybe she's new, they'd say, or maybe she keeps to herself. But I'd been living with Claire for weeks by then. The fact that no one remembered her sent chills down my spine, colder than the air in our room. That's when I started to watch her more closely. Every time we were in the room together, I'd glance at her, trying to figure out what was off. She moved so slowly, so deliberately, like every step she took was calculated. And then there were her eyes. I hadn't noticed it before, but they were empty. Not in the she's tired kind of way, but like there was nothing behind them. No life, no emotion. just a blank, hollow stare that made my skin crawl every time she looked at me. The whispers grew louder at night, though Claire never seemed to hear them. I'd lie awake, my breath visible in the freezing air, listening as they swirled around me. They were starting to sound more like voices now, dozens of them, maybe more. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized something that made my heart race. They weren't just random whispers. They were calling my name. By this point, I couldn't take it anymore. The cold, the whispers, the way Claire seemed to drift through the room like a shadow. It was all too much. I decided I had to leave. It wasn't even a choice anymore. I packed my things late one night, trying to be quiet so Claire wouldn't notice. She was sitting on her bed, as usual, staring at the wall, completely still. I didn't bother saying goodbye. I just grabbed my bag and headed for the door, desperate to get out of that room and never look back. But when I reached the hallway, something strange happened. I could have sworn I'd walked straight to the exit, but somehow I found myself back at our door. At first I thought I was just disoriented. Maybe I was so freaked out that I'd turned around without realizing it. So I tried again. This time I made sure to focus on every step, counting them as I went. But the moment I reached the end of the hall, there I was, back in front of our room. My heart started pounding. How was that even possible? I tried again and again, each time with more desperation. I'd take different paths, rush through the corridors, but it was always the same. No matter how far I thought I'd gone, I'd end up right back at the door. It was as if the building itself was trapping me, refusing to let me leave. And every time I returned, Claire would still be there, sitting on her bed, those hollow eyes tracking my every move. It was like she knew, like she was waiting for me to realize there was no escape. I thought maybe it was just some kind of anxiety attack or that I was losing my grip on reality. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something was keeping me there. Something that didn't want me to leave. I tried calling for help, but every time I picked up my phone, the signal would drop. Texts wouldn't send, and the few calls I managed to make were just static on the other end. It felt like I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. I even tried talking to the RA again, pounding on their door late at night, but when they opened it, they just looked at me with this confused expression, like they didn't recognize me. "You okay?" they asked, as if I was some random stranger. I told them about Claire, about the strange things happening in our room, but they just shrugged it off. "You must be stressed," they said. "Maybe you should take a break." A break? I was being haunted by my own roommate, and they thought I needed a break. After that, I knew I was on my own. I went back to the room, feeling utterly defeated. Claire was still there, sitting in the same spot, watching me. Her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, and for the first time, I felt real fear. Not the kind of fear that makes your heart race, but the kind that sinks deep into your bones, cold and paralyzing. It was like she knew I couldn't leave, like she had me exactly where she wanted. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me, breathing down my neck. Claire hadn't moved from her bed. She just sat there staring at nothing, like she was waiting for something, or someone. It was sometime around dawn when I noticed something strange in the closet. A small journal tucked away behind a pile of old clothes that I hadn't touched in months. I don't know why I hadn't seen it before, but I guess nothing about that room made sense anymore. The journal belonged to someone named Megan. I didn't recognize the name, but from the dates written in the margins, she must have lived in the same dorm years ago. As I flipped through the pages, my blood ran cold. Megan had written about her roommate, Claire. She described everything, how Claire didn't seem to exist outside of their room, how no one else could remember her, how the air had grown colder and whispers had started to fill the room at night. It was all there, like some twisted reflection of my own experience. The further I read, the more terrified I became. Megan's last few entries were frantic, scrawled with shaky handwriting. She wrote about trying to leave, just like I had. But no matter what she did, she always ended up back in the room. And then her writing stopped. No explanation, no final words. Just an abrupt end, like she had vanished into thin air. My hands shook as I closed the journal. I knew, without a doubt, that Claire had done something to Megan, just like she was going to do to me. I could feel it now, the hunger. It wasn't just the cold air or the whispers. There was something else, something darker, feeding off me. I realized that Claire wasn't just some ghost or figment of my imagination. She was something ancient, something that had been feeding off students like Megan and me for who knows how long. And the worst part? She wasn't finished. Not yet. Every night, as the whispers grew louder, I could feel her draining me, little by little. I was just another meal for her, and soon I'd be gone too. I tried burning the journal, thinking maybe that would break whatever hold Claire had on me. But the moment the flames touched the pages, they went out, as if the air itself refused to let them burn. That's when I knew there was no escape. Not from Claire, not from whatever force was keeping her here. I was trapped, and the only thing left to do was wait. Wait for her to finish what she had started. The worst part of all this, I can feel her hunger growing. It's not just me she wants. It's anyone who steps foot in this dorm. I can't leave, but maybe I can warn you. If you ever find yourself assigned to room 31B in Manton University, don't stay. Don't even unpack. Claire is still here, watching, waiting, and she's always hungry. Don't make the same mistake I did. I remember the first night I moved into the top floor of that old, creaky dorm at Westbrook University. It was late September and the air had that crisp, almost eerie chill that you only feel at the start of autumn. You know, the kind that makes you shiver but you can't quite explain why. I had just settled in, trying to make the place feel a bit more like home. Hanging up some posters, unpacking books, the usual stuff. It was a quiet building, which was honestly one of the reasons I chose it. Top floor, peace, and quiet, away from the noise of everyone else. But I guess you can never predict what you're really signing up for, huh? That first night was when it all started. I was sitting at my desk, just staring out the window, my mind wandering after a long day of classes. It wasn't exactly the best view, just the top of the campus trees and a glimpse of the sky. But as I sat there, something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection, but no. There it was, a face, outside my window. And let me tell you, that window, it's on the 4th floor. There's no fire escape, no balcony, nothing. So, logically, there's no way anyone could be standing there. I blinked, shook my head, even rubbed my eyes like I was in some cheesy horror movie. But the face didn't go away. It was just there. Pale, almost translucent, with these dark, hollow eyes. Its mouth? It wasn't exactly smiling, but there was this tight, unnatural pull at the corners, like it was trying to. I laughed it off at first, thinking maybe I was just tired, you know? A long day, new place, unfamiliar surroundings. It had to be in my head, right? But as the night wore on, that chill in the room, it didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I tried to focus on something else, opened up my laptop, threw on some music, anything to drown out that creeping sense of unease. But every time I looked at the window, even out of the corner of my eye, I swear I could still see it. That face, just watching, not moving, not doing anything, just staring. I pulled the curtains closed, convinced that would fix it. If I couldn't see it, it wasn't real. That's what I told myself. Funny how your brain tries to rationalize the irrational. But even with the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the feeling. You ever get that sense that someone's in the room with you? Even when you know logically there's no one there? That's exactly how I felt. It wasn't just in my head. It was in the room. I don't know how else to explain it. It's like that face wasn't just outside the window anymore. It had moved. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, lingering in the shadows, making the air heavy, suffocating. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every rustle of the leaves outside, it all felt amplified, like the building was alive, watching me too. I told myself I'd laugh about it in the morning, chalk it up to an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know how wrong it would get. That was just the beginning, though. Things were about to get so much worse. It was the next night when I realized I wasn't imagining things. I tried to go about my day as usual. Class, lunch with some friends, the typical college routine. I didn't mention the face to anyone. Honestly, how do you even bring something like that up without sounding completely nuts? Hey, so I saw a face outside my 4th floor window last night. Yeah, no thanks. But even during the day, there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That face, that thing, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. And I was about to be reminded of that, in the worst possible way. That night, as soon as I walked into my room, I could feel it. You know when you walk into a space and you can just tell something's off? It's like the air itself feels different, heavier, colder. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself it was just nerves. But the minute I glanced at the window, my heart stopped. The face was back. This time, though, it was closer. I could see more of it now, its features sharper, that pale skin almost glowing in the dim light from the campus below. And the eyes. God, those hollow eyes. They looked empty, like there was nothing human behind them. I froze. My body wanted to move, wanted to run, but it's like I was rooted to the spot. All I could do was stare. The face didn't move, didn't change expression. But there was something new this time, its mouth. It wasn't just pulled into that weird, almost smile anymore. It was wider. Not enough to be a grin, but enough to make my skin crawl. It was like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to react, maybe. But I couldn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I managed to tear my eyes away and pull the curtains shut, my hands shaking. But the thing is, even with the curtains closed, I knew it was still there. I could feel it. Every part of me was screaming to leave. But where was I supposed to go? It's not like I could tell my RA, "Hey, there's a creepy face stalking me from outside my 4th floor window." They'd laugh me out of the dorm. Or worse, think I'd lost it. The next few days I tried avoiding my room as much as possible. I stayed out late, hung around campus, anything to not be alone in that space. But no matter where I went, that sense of being watched never left me. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes peering at me from behind some corner. I didn't, of course, but the feeling lingered. And every night without fail, the face would be there, closer and clearer than the night before. I started asking around, casually at first, trying to see if anyone else had noticed anything weird. But no one had. My friends thought I was just stressed, maybe overworked with midterms coming up. They had no idea what I was dealing with. How could they? This thing, it wasn't interested in anyone else, just me. And that's when the paranoia really set in. I started avoiding my window entirely, but it didn't matter. I knew, deep down, that face was always there, lurking, watching. I could feel its presence even when I wasn't looking. It was like a shadow in my mind, always creeping closer, never leaving me alone. I'll never forget the night it started knocking. Up until then, it had just been the face, silent, unnerving, but at least it wasn't doing anything. That all changed when the storm hit. It was one of those heavy, violent storms, with the kind of rain that pounds against the windows so hard it sounds like it's trying to break in. I remember sitting at my desk, headphones in, trying to drown out the noise. But even with music blasting in my ears, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch hitting the glass. But this wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach twisted into knots because I already knew where it was coming from. My window. That damn window. I yanked off my headphones, heart racing, and turned toward the sound. And there it was. The face, pressed right up against the glass this time, as if it was trying to push through. Its eyes were wide now, more intense, more focused. And its mouth, it had stretched even further into a grotesque, unnatural grin. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body locked up in fear, paralyzed by the sight of that face, so close, so real. The knocking continued, soft but steady, like it was taunting me, daring me to open the window. My mind was racing. Was this thing trying to get in? Was it just playing with me, or was there something worse waiting if I made the wrong move? Panicked, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my phone and tried to record it. If I could just capture it on video, I'd have proof that I wasn't going crazy. But when I looked through the camera, there was nothing. No face, no knocking, just the rain and the empty night beyond. My heart sank. How was that even possible? It was right there. The moment I lowered my phone, though, the face was back, staring at me, unblinking, and the knocking resumed, louder this time, more insistent. It was as if the thing knew I was trying to catch it and wanted to remind me that it was in control, that it could show itself whenever it wanted, and there was nothing I could do about it. I slammed the curtains shut again, but the knocking didn't stop. It followed me, echoing through the room, no matter where I stood. I heard it behind me, above me, inside, my head. It was everywhere, and that's when I realized this thing wasn't just at my window anymore. It was in my life now, creeping into every corner of my mind, every moment of my day. Even after the storm passed, the knocking didn't fade. It was there in every quiet moment, in every pause between conversations, in every second of silence. I couldn't escape it. It was with me, everywhere, every moment, growing louder, more demanding. I didn't know what it wanted, but I was terrified to find out. After that night, I couldn't take it anymore. The knocking, the face, it had taken over my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. It felt like the walls of my room were closing in on me, suffocating me with its presence. So, I made the decision to leave. I packed up everything I could and moved off campus to a small apartment across town. It was a quick decision, made in desperation, and I convinced myself that putting distance between me and that dorm would solve everything. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of relief as I set up in my new place. The apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building, far from campus, far from that window and its cursed view. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, and more importantly, it felt safe. I remember thinking, finally I can breathe again. I told myself that whatever had been haunting me at the dorm couldn't follow me here. It was over, or at least I wanted to believe that. But that night, as I was settling in, I heard it. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, a faint knock. I froze. My mind immediately went to that face, but I quickly shook it off. No way, I thought. It's just a new building. Old pipes, maybe. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more familiar, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the window, and there it was, that same face, staring at me from the other side of the glass. I couldn't believe it. I had moved miles away, to a completely different part of town, and yet, it had followed me. The face was even closer this time, pressed right up against the window, its grin wider than ever before. Its eyes were locked on mine, as if it was daring me to make a move. The knocking grew more insistent, more menacing, like it was trying to break through the glass. I backed away, my entire body trembling. How was this possible? How could it find me here? I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone wouldn't connect. It was as if the face was somehow interfering, making sure I was alone, trapped with it. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but where would I go? It wasn't just tied to the dorm, it was tied to me. I realized then that running wouldn't help. No matter where I went, it would follow. I was never really free. The worst part was the realization that it didn't just want to scare me. It wanted something more. There was a reason it kept following me, showing up night after night. And I had no idea what that reason was. But I knew one thing. I couldn't give it what it wanted. I wouldn't. But that didn't stop it from trying. Every night the knocking would return, relentless, as if it was growing impatient. No matter how much I moved, No matter where I went, that face was always there. It was as if it was a part of my shadow now, following me wherever I went. I stopped sleeping, stopped going to class. What was the point? The thing had consumed my life, my thoughts, my entire existence, and I had no idea how to stop it. Years have passed since I left Westbrook University, but the face never left me. I moved across the country, changed my job, even tried to start fresh in new places where no one knew me or what I'd been through. But none of it mattered. The face, that face, still finds me. It's no longer just at my windows. Sometimes I see it in mirrors, or reflections in puddles, or even the gleam of a passing car's windows. It doesn't matter where I am or how far I go. It's always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to notice. The worst part is that no one else ever sees it. I've tried to explain, to show people, but it's like I'm the only one who's cursed to see it. They just think I'm paranoid or suffering from some kind of trauma. I don't blame them. How could anyone understand what it's like to live with something like this? Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced that it's standing right outside my bedroom window, even though I've moved to the third floor of a building with no easy access to the windows. And the knocking, it never stopped. It doesn't happen every night anymore, but when it does, it's unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tap, like a reminder that it's still here. Still waiting. I've learned to ignore it, but that doesn't mean it's any less terrifying. Every time I hear it, my mind races back to those nights in the dorm, and the fear grips me just as tight as it did back then. I thought I could outlast it, ignore it until it went away. But I was wrong. I've tried everything. Therapy, moving to remote places, even staying away from windows for weeks at a time. Nothing works. It's always there, and sometimes when I catch a glimpse of it, I swear its smile is wider than before, like it knows something I don't, like it's been waiting for something, and it's getting closer to whatever that is. I don't know what it wants, and at this point, I'm too scared to find out. I can't even trust my own reflections anymore. Every time I see myself in a mirror, I half expect to see it standing right behind me, grinning that sick, twisted grin. I avoid mirrors as much as possible now, but it doesn't matter. It finds ways to remind me that it's there. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of it in the corner of my eye, just for a split second, and then it's gone, like it never existed at all. But I know better. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I think it's looking for someone new, someone to haunt, someone to follow. Maybe you've seen it already. A face in a window where there shouldn't be one. A knock at your door when no one's there. If you have, then you know what's coming. And if you haven't, you will. Once it finds you, it never leaves.